Before we get to the second part of the preview of the weekend action around MLS, I have a couple of news that I'm going to be talking about, and unfortunately we are going to start with a bit of a sad news. One of the most important figure in American soccer community, in Daryl Grove, unfortunately passed away at an age of only 40 because of colon cancer. And for those of you that don't exactly know who Daryl Grove is, he is one of the co-hosts of, in my opinion, probably my most favorite soccer podcast here in the U.S. in the Total Soccer Show, alongside with Taylor Rockwell. And last year, when there was an announcement that Daryl Grove basically diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, there was definitely a lot of fear that, unfortunately, the day was going to come where we are no longer going to have Daryl Grove on the show, and that, fortunately, he, of course, would pass away. And it's sad that today is finally the day to happen, and that, certainly I want to give all my condolence toward Daryl Grove's family, and also the other co-host of the Total Soccer Show, Taylor Rockwell, who, today when I listened to his podcast and when he was kind of talking about making that announcement that unfortunately his longtime partner has passed away, you can clearly tell he was trying very hard to hold back tears, because I cannot imagine how is he feeling right now, that this will be the first of what could be many show that he won't have his longtime partner, and especially when you have such a relationship with him like that is definitely going to be tough for him to go through. So certainly I send my condolence toward him, and also alongside with the Daryl Grove family, that this is probably the worst time to lose a family member, especially during the time when we're in a pandemic where everybody is already kind of suffering because of it. This is kind of the last thing they need to, of course, deal with, and it's very sad that we, of course, saw this news today. But on a bit of a lighter news, the Supporters Shield. So remember how I said last week that the Supporters Shield was not going to be awarded, and I even did a video where I kind of did a devil's advocate in terms of just ongoing criticism going on with how the Supporters Shield is not awarding this year, and it's absolutely wrong. Well, guess what? It seemed like the Supporters Shield Foundation Board heard those ongoing criticism, and they're saying that, yep, we're going to bring it back, and that the Supporters Shield indeed is going to be awarded this year. And the funny thing is, when they, of course, announced that, I once again hear more ongoing criticism saying that, oh, why are they now bringing it back when we basically said before we don't want it because of how this season has been. I mean, that's just kind of the way today's world is, especially on social media, where it seems like there's a lot of double standard that is going on right now. But that being said, this does perfectly transition in terms of the first game I'm going to talk about, which is Philly and Toronto. So this game, of course, is the battle of the top 2 team in the Eastern Conference. But because of the announcement that the Supporters Shield is coming back and it will be awarded this year, this has definitely changed some complexion in terms of this game, where this is now really could be a battle between 2 teams that most likely is going to win the Supporters Shield this year. TFC currently have a 12-5-2 record, while Philly has an 11-5-3 record. This game kicks off at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. There's a 3-point gap between both of these teams, with TFC currently sitting at the top of the Eastern Conference with 41 points, and Philly currently in second with 38 points. But if Philly does win this game, they will go top of the Eastern Conference, because their goal differential is actually a little bit better than TFC, and that Philly would get the same amount of wins and losses as Toronto if they do win this game against TFC. Whereas for TFC, if they can get a draw or even get a win in this game against Philly, not only the fact that they remain at the top of the Eastern Conference, but at minimum they are going to open up a 4-point gap, and they're definitely look like they're going to run away to potentially winning the Supporters Shield this year. Now, in the last 5 games for the Union, it was a 2-1 win that they had against New England, although that was kind of a very nerve-wracking win that they had to face against a Rev team that were piling the pressure on them late in the game. They did drew 2-2 against DC United before winning 2-1 against Montreal, 3-0 against FC Cincinnati at home. And the last time both of these teams, of course, matched each other, it was TFC, the one that able to get a 2-1 win over the Union. Now, for TFC, they are actually on a 9-game unbeaten run, and they currently have the second longest unbeaten run alongside with Orlando, who currently have the longest with 13 games. They, of course, won 1-0 against Atlanta in the last game before drawing 1-1 against the Red Bulls at home. Then it was a 1-0 win on the road against FC Cincinnati before, as I mentioned, actually, this is wrong here. They didn't win 3-1 against Philly. That was actually, I think that was, oh God, I need to double check to see who they won 3-1 against there. But prior to that, they did win 2-1 against the Union, and that, coming into this match, obviously there's also some stake in terms of the fact that the Union are looking to try to remain perfect at home, as they're the only team right now in the league to have a perfect record at home. But that could definitely be in serious jeopardy, consider, as I said, TFC, they have been red hot in the last couple of games, and they're once again on a very long unbeaten run so far this season. And judging by the fact that the Union this season, this one of the biggest criticism with the Union this year is that while they have been in the top part of the Eastern Conference, when they do play against these top teams like TFC or Columbus or even Orlando City, they don't actually get resort against those teams. And because of that, many people do question the fact that, yes, they of course might make a deep run into the playoffs, but once they play against these tough teams and showing the fact that in the past they haven't get resort against this big team, are they actually a contender in terms of MLS Cup? Well, for the Union, if they want to kind of shut up all those doubters and kind of silence the critics, the fact that they can definitely be an MLS Cup contender and beat against some of the best team in the Eastern Conference, this is a good opportunity for them to do it, to get a win, to get themselves at the top of the Eastern Conference, and there should be no more doubters in terms of the fact that whether or not if this team can actually play again, get a win against a team that could also be rivaling them for MLS Cup. But I think coming into this game, I'm going to give Toronto the edge of this because, again, they have been just red hot in these last couple of games, and they're definitely on verge of winning the Supporter Shield. And the Union in these last couple of games, they definitely have looked shaky. I mean, there's no doubt that there's started to be a little bit of a crack that is in that defense. I mean, in the last game against New England, they could have easily drawn or lost that game with the way that New England was really piling the pressure. And that 2-2 draw that they have against DC, they almost lost that one if it wasn't for a McKenzie super strike. And then in that Montreal game, that wasn't a very convincing home win too against Montreal, and that if the Impact were a little bit more clinical in terms of finishing, that would have been a different result too. So cracks are starting to show with this Union team in the last couple of games, and that you don't want to have that when you have to face against the best team right now in the league in TFC. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is Houston versus Columbus. So the Columbus Crew currently have a 10-4-4 record, while the Dynamo has a 4-8-7 record, as this game is going to kick off at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. And I have a feeling whoever is going to win this game will really shed some demons in terms of their recent matches, because for Houston, they have only won one in the last 10 games. And for a team that are trying to battle to get those last couple of spots and be one of the last team in the Western Conference, you cannot afford to keep going into the form that they're in right now, only winning one game out of the last 10 games, and that last 10 games include the stretch where they basically had no Albert Feliz in this team, and they ever since they sold him off to Portugal, they have looked absolutely toothless going forward on the attack. Now for Columbus, they have yet to win on the road this season, but the good news for the Crew is that they could get some key players back into this game. The likes of Lucas Zalarian, Eloy room, and most importantly, Darlington Nagbe could be back for the Columbus Crew in this game, so that should give them a little bit boost coming into this one against a struggling Houston team, which in the last 5 games, they drew 2-2 against Minnesota in a game that they should have won, consider how much they were dominating in the second half. Then they suffer a 3-1 loss in the hands of Nashville before losing 1-0 on the road against Inter Miami. They did win 2-0 against FC Dallas, which were a win that really snapped out of a very miserable run that the Dynamo has. But before that, they lost 2-1 against SKC at home. Well, for Columbus, speaking of miserable run, they finally snapped a pretty miserable run where they lost 3 out of the last 4 games on a 4-game winless run by winning 3-1 against NYCFC at home. But before that, they of course suffered their first ever Hell is Real derby loss against FC Cincinnati, then losing 2-1 against Montreal to suffer their first home loss and the first time that they actually dropped points at home. Then it was a 2-2 draw between them and FC Dallas before losing 3-1 on the road against TFC. And that, coming in this game, there's definitely a lot of implication. The fact that, for Columbus, they're looking to try to get some win. And that now that they, of course, started to get some of their key players back, they're looking to try to get these guys back into full fitness where it's going to be in time in terms of them making a run in the playoffs. Whereas for Houston, as I said, they need to figure things out in these next couple of games. And that, even though I know Albert Feliz, who's no longer with this team, have really hurt this one, they still have enough attacking power in that team that should step up. And guys like Mauro Manotas, Ariel Lassiter, and all those attacking pieces just have not stepped up in these last couple of games, and that if they really need to step those guys, if Houston are going to make the playoffs this season, those guys really need to step up, because right now the only attacking threat that Houston has is Darwin Quintero, and Quintero in the last couple of games, while he has definitely done very well, he can't just single-handedly carry this team and expect that this team could potentially have some playoff implication. And let's also not to mention that their defense is still a mess right now. So yeah, this is a big game for both of these teams in both ends of the table, and we shall see who exactly could get the resort. But now moving on in terms of the next match is Sporting KC and the Colorado Rapids. Yes, the Rapids are finally back after going a month on hiatus after they had COVID-19 cases that were going on in terms of their team, and that they kind of also had a bit of an outbreak, and hence this is why I am wearing my Colorado Rapids t-shirt, because I want to wear this to kind of welcome them back in terms of playing some MLS games, as their record currently is 5-4-4, and despite the fact that they're currently 11th in the Western Conference, if the league is going to go to a points per game kind of ways to determine playoffs, which most likely that could be the case, then the Rapids, of course, are now currently in 4th place in terms of points per game ratio, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be a lot of teams in the Western Conference are going to be pissed off the fact that Colorado are all the way up to 4th place based on points per game, even though they haven't really played a lot of these games, and they've been absent for so many games right now. Now, for Sporting KC, they're currently 9-3-6, and I'm pretty sure they're probably the most happiest side after yesterday Cascadia Derby, because with both Seattle and Portland dropping points this week, this is now a second opportunity for Sporting KC to potentially go top of the West with a win against the Rapids after they failed to do it in that 2-2 draw against the Chicago Fire. And for Colorado, as I said, this is the first time that they're playing an MLS game in what seemed like an eternity. That is September 23rd, when they, of course, won 5-0 against the Quakes. And I'm very interested to see how the Rapids are going to look for the rest of the season, because, for the rest of the season right now, it's going to be interesting how they can, of course, get themselves back to match fitness. And remember, before they had a long spell of unable to play games because of their team getting a COVID-19 outbreak, they were actually on the rise, and that they were definitely looking like a team that could really not only make the playoffs, but maybe even challenge for the top 4 spot into the playoffs. Well, right now, they're currently top 4 in terms of points per game game standpoint. So it'll be interesting to see if they can continue to do that. Although I have a feeling in this game, most likely SKC is going to win this one, knowing the fact that, you know, Colorado, this is the first game that they're playing in over a month, and when you haven't played a game in over a month, the rust is going to be a big factor, and there's going to be a lot of guys that's going to be very tired in the second half because they're not back to full match fitness. Now, for Sporting KC, as I mentioned, they drew 2-2 against Chicago in a game that they should have won if they didn't gave up a late goal. Then they did lose a controversial game against FC Dallas 1-0, which something tells me Peter Vermees is still angry about that resort. Then they did win 2-1 at home against Nashville, win 1-0 against Chicago before winning 2-1 on the road against the Houston Dynamo. But as I said, big opportunity for SKC to play against a Colorado team that's definitely not back to match fitness and get themselves a chance to get back at the top of the Western Conference. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is RSL versus Dallas. So this game definitely have a lot of playoff implications because RSL is currently 5-6-7, while Dallas is 6-6-5, and this game kicks off at 9:30 p.m. Eastern, 6:30 p.m. Pacific. RSL, of course, is currently just outside of the playoff picture in 9th place, but they're tied with Vancouver for the last spot in the West. And if we are going to go with a points per game ratio to determine playoffs, then RSL would be in the playoffs because their points per game ratio is a little bit better than what Vancouver is, and they play one less game than what Vancouver right now has. Now, for Dallas, they have only won one game out of the last 6 games, and they're alongside with their in-state rival Houston Dynamo is a team that is started to unravel in probably the worst time possible. And the last 5 games for RSL, you know, talk about unraveling. RSL also were kind of unraveling during this time too, but they got a huge 2-1 win against the Portland Timbers to end a very miserable run where they lost 2-1 on the road against the Vancouver Whitecaps, lost 2-1 against Seattle, lost 3-1 at home against LAFC before drawing 0-0 against Minnesota on the road. For Dallas, they lost 3-0 to Nashville back on Tuesday. Then they, of course, did win 1-0, but in a controversial way against Sporting KC. They lost 2-0 in the Texas Derby against Houston, drew 2-2 against Columbus at home, and drew 0-0 against Orlando City at home. And judging by the fact that this is a road game for Dallas, yeah, this probably means that it's going to be a loss or a draw for FC Dallas, especially this is a team that has just struggled this season on the road and aren't able to get some result. And knowing the fact that RSL is really hungry to try to build up that huge win that they got last weekend against the Portland Timbers, this is a game that I'm pretty sure RSL are going to try to get all 3 points and definitely get themselves in contention in terms of playoffs. In fact, I think these next 2 games for RSL is going to be very big because after this one, they're going to be playing against the Quakes on the road, and that game could really determine who, of course, is making the playoffs. And I'm already going to call it the fact that game between the Quakes and RSL, one of those teams are not going to make the playoffs this year. Like, that is going to be a guarantee for me, the fact that one of these teams is going to somehow miss out at the end of the year. But speaking of which, and talking about the Quakes, that's who I'm going to be talking about, as they are going to be playing against the Vancouver Whitecaps on the road. The Whitecaps currently have a 7-0-12 record, while the Quakes have a 6-6-7 record and are currently in 7th place, while Vancouver is currently having the last spot in the playoffs. But as I said, if we do go to points per game ratio, Vancouver will unfortunately be out of the playoff position, and this game kicks off at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. Now, the Quakes, they are red hot in the last 6 games with a 4-1-1 record, and, you know, I know there's going to be people that have been kind of criticizing me by being kind of negative with the Quakes. I mean, I know that they have been red hot in these last couple of games, but you can already see that I have already had some criticism and kind of always bring up this false hope about the Quakes, the fact that, yes, they can go on a hot streak, but at the end of the day, you know, I've seen this story before, and it feels like, since I've seen this story so many times before, they're not fooling me whatsoever, the fact that eventually they're going to hit that moment where they're going to potentially collapse and not make the playoffs. Now, that being said, I will say this with the Quakes. I think they've definitely played much better in these last 6 games. I mean, not only they have played much better, they look 100 times better than when they were giving up like 6, 7, or 5 goals to opponent and are shipping teams goals and not only gifting them free points but also helping their goal differential in some sense. But in these last 6 games, they definitely have played better, not only on the attacking side where they've been able to score some goals, and there are a couple of players that is really proving me wrong. I'm looking at you, Andy Rios, who somehow in some way is making me eat so much shit right now in these last couple of games with the way that he's been scoring goals left and right. But you gotta also give credit to the defense that, as I said, this defense were like invincible for the past couple of games prior to this hot streak, and they were literally letting goals for fun. Well, in these last couple of games, it seemed like they have definitely performed much better, and part of that has to do with the way that they've been playing bad team. But you also got to give credit with the fact that I think Almeida has made some adjustment in terms of the defense. I mean, he still does go with a man marking system, but it's in a way where it's not as extreme as before, where he just man marked everywhere, and that it was pretty much all or nothing if one of the guys decided to basically fail to man mark the player, and that he of course could go through on goal. That isn't kind of the case I've been seeing with this team. And that one guy I've also want to kind of mention with the Quakes that I feel like this is a guy that is clearly underappreciated and probably is maybe the most underrated defensive midfield in the league, has to be Judson. I mean, Judson, this past couple of games, especially in that game against Seattle, which I thought he was the best player and probably would win the Man of the Match award in the last game, he has been an absolute engine, and that feels like he's everywhere with the way that he's been playing, not only contributing on the attacking end but also on the defensive end too. Kind of in some way remind me of a Diego Chara for the Portland Timbers, where he just feels like he's everywhere, whether it's on the attacking end or on the defensive end. Now, that being said, as much as I am finally giving some praise to the Quakes, they got to be careful coming into this game against the Whitecaps, because the Whitecaps, yes, they did suffer an embarrassing 1-0 loss against the Galaxy, but prior to that, they did win 2-1 at home against LAFC, won 2-1 against RSL. They did lose 3-0 against the Quakes on the road, but they were down to 9 men in that game and kind of lost their heads a little bit. And then they lose 3-1 against Seattle on the road, whereas for the Quakes, they got a gritty 0-0 draw against the best team in the Western Conference in the Seattle Sounders. They then put up probably the most impressive road performance I've seen from the Quakes in years with a 4-0 win against the Galaxy. They did lose 3-0 against the Timbers, although I think if you actually watch that game, the score didn't really put justice the fact that the Quakes actually played very decently in this one and could have got a result if things kind of went their way a little bit. And then, as I mentioned, they won 3-0 against Vancouver and win 2-1 against the Galaxy. But the reason why I gotta say that the Quakes gotta be a little bit careful coming into this game is because, first, this game is played at Providence Park, and you know my spiel in terms of the Quakes playing on the road against Providence Park. And even though I know they're not playing the Timbers in this game, they still have not won at Providence Park. And this is going to be no difference no matter what opponent that the Quakes are playing. That it just feels like whenever the Quakes play at Providence Park, it is a house of horror for them every time they play at there where they aren't able to get a victory. And that the second thing I also think that the Quakes got to be careful is that this Vancouver team does have some decent talent, and if guys like Cavallini can really get going, which by the way, Cavallini did not play in that 3-0 loss against Vancouver, and I thought that was a pretty big loss that they suffered. And if Cavallini was actually in that game, maybe the result would have been different. So yeah, the Quakes got to be very careful with them, and especially as I said the last time when the Quakes play against the Whitecaps, they got to be careful not to get exposed on the counter attack, and that they got to do better in terms of defending set piece, because if there's two things that the Quakes still struggle right now is try to deal with teams that hit them on the counter attack, and also set piece defending, especially on corner defending, where there's still struggles in terms of doing that department. But that being said, I think this should be a win for the Quakes, and as I mentioned before, these next 2 games for the Quakes are going to really be the game that determine where they make the playoffs or not. I mean, after this, they play against RSL, another team that they are fighting in terms of getting the last couple of spots of the playoffs, and that if they can, of course, get maximum points in these next 2 games, I think it wouldn't matter in terms of the LAFC and Seattle resort in the last 2 games of the season, and that they pretty much are going to be 99% secure in terms of making the playoffs. But moving on now into the last game on this board is none other than El Tráfico between LAFC versus the Galaxy, as LAFC is coming into this game at a 7-4-7 record, while the Galaxy have a 5-3-9 record. This game is going to be on Sunday, and it's going to be on ABC, and it's also going to be a lunchtime kickoff of 3:30 p.m. Eastern, 12:30 p.m. local time, where this game is going to be kicking off. Now, LAFC had a good result against Portland by scoring a late goal to draw 1-1 against the Portland Timbers, while the Galaxy, they finally snapped that 6-game losing run by winning 1-0 against the Vancouver Whitecaps. Last 5 games for LAFC, as I mentioned, they drew 1-1 against Portland on the road. They did lose 2-1 against Vancouver before winning 3-1 against Seattle, then 3-1 on the road against RSL, and then lost 2-1 against the Quakes after they gave up a goal in a very late moment in that one. Now, for the Galaxy, as I mentioned, that 1-0 win from Vancouver definitely gave Schelotto a little bit more time right now, although I still feel like he is still in an incredible hot seat right now. Consider the fact that there's no doubt if the Galaxy does not make the playoffs this season, it is going to be a huge failure for this team, and that there could be some changes that is going to happen with this team. But prior to that, it was probably the lowest point for the Galaxy by losing 4-0 against their rival, the San Jose Earthquakes. Then they lost 6-3 at home to the Portland Timbers, lost 2-1 on the road to the Quakes again, before losing 3-1 at home in the hands of the Seattle Sounders. And, this game, coming into this one, I think this El Tráfico is going to be bigger for the Galaxy than it is for LAFC, because I have heard that LAFC probably is not going to get some of their starters that are on international duty back in this game, although there is rumors saying that those guys like Diego Rossi and Brian Rodriguez could return to this team as soon as next week. But for the Galaxy, this is just getting to a point where they're dead last in the Western Conference. They've been giving a little bit of a lifeline with them winning 1-0 against Vancouver, and that if they do not win this game, they could find themselves as much as 6 points behind the red line, and that they're going to have 3 games to go and win. And as I said yesterday in my video, talk about DC and FC Cincinnati, where those are also 2 teams that is in the bottom of the Eastern Conference and are fighting to be relevant in terms of contending for the playoffs. This goes same with the Galaxy. Like, they cannot afford to lose this game against a relatively weak LAFC team. But as for LAFC, I think in this game, as much as I know there's going to be always pressure of them saying that they have to win against a very weak Galaxy team, and probably the weakest Galaxy team that they, of course, gets to face. The reason why I say that they don't really have as much pressure is because once they do get some of their guys back in the starting 11, I think they are going to like a late push, and that once we do get to the playoffs, no matter where LAFC is going to be seated, whether in the top 4 or right where they are currently in 4th place in the Western Conference, they are going to be a threat heading into the playoffs. Like, they are going to get their best player with the likes of Vela, Rossi, and Rodriguez back into this team, and when they do get those guys back into the team, watch out. This could be a really dangerous team, and this would be a team that you definitely do not want to face when you're in the playoffs. Well, besides, if you're the Seattle Sounders, I'm pretty sure if you're the Sounders, you would always take it to face against LAFC in the playoffs. But any other team, I don't think they want to play LAFC in the playoffs, because they know that this is an LAFC team that is on a mission in the playoffs, and they're trying to shed some demons and trying to silence all the critics of them saying that they always choke whenever they get into the playoff stage. But there you have it. That is pretty much it for the preview of these weekend's action. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of all these games? And as always, let me know in the comments your prediction of these last 6 games that's going to be happening in this weekend's action. But until then, hope you guys enjoy this video, and I will see you guys next time.